Good afternoon. I'm Ellie Meierveld, CEO at the Holocaust Memorial Center. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's talk, especially our museum members and donors. Your support has allowed us to provide complimentary virtual programming throughout the pandemic. We truly appreciate your generosity. I want to thank especially the program supporters today, Robin and Leo Eisenberg, Gary Cappy, Denise and Peter Rogers, Rochelle and Barry Rubin, and also our community partners, the Interfaith Leadership Council of Metropolitan Detroit and Religious Diversity Journeys. It is my honor to introduce our speaker today. Zlata Filipovic is the author of the international bestseller, Zlata's Diary, and the co-editor of Stolen Voices, Young People's War Diaries from World War I through Iraq. A documentary filmmaker, Filipovic speaks around the world about her experiences and has worked with organizations such as the Anne Frank House, United Nations, and UNICEF. I am pleased to welcome Ms. Zlata Filipovic.
Thank you so much for having me. It's very heartening to see how this virtual room is filling up with all the participants. I'm joining you today from Dublin, Ireland, where I've been living for the last 25 years. Yeah, it's very exciting, and thank you so much to the Holocaust Memorial Center, who contacted me many months ago, and somehow this October 3rd has rolled in very fast, and it's really a pleasure to be here with you. So what I'm going to do is talk about my own personal experiences. I grew up in a country called Bosnia, which was part of the former Yugoslavia. So I'll speak about my own personal experiences. I'll speak about the wider work that I did after I was very fortunate and had a chance to leave Bosnia, and about my work today. So as I said, I was born in Bosnia, in the capital, Sarajevo, and I was born in 1980. And I was born into a middle-class family. You know, my father was a lawyer, my mom was a chemical engineer. We had many friends. I was an only child. We lived in the center of Sarajevo in a beautiful apartment that was overlooking onto the streets and the hills that were surrounding Sarajevo. When I was 4 years old, we had the Olympic Games, which took place in Sarajevo. So that's when I stood on skis for the first time, and these beautiful mountains welcomed the world. The mountains that were surrounding Sarajevo welcomed the world, athletes from around the world, and provided me. Every winter I would go there and enjoy it. Every summer we would go to the Croatian coast and have wonderful holidays there. I went to school. I went to music school. I played tennis. I was a very good student and really enjoyed doing well in school. I had lots of friends as a result of being an only child, so I was kind of turned outwards to all my, to kind of making those connections with friends. And now I realize I had the most perfect idyllic childhood. And my own experience of war and conflict really was only things that I would have seen on television and films, or things that we would have learned in school. And when I was about 10 years old, I read, about a year before my life changed forever, I read the diary of Anne Frank, and my heart was broken for her. I thought she was the most incredible writer. The story of her story and the story of her family really broke my heart. And I thought, well, this is something that only happens in history, or it happens to, people who are far away from me in some way, whether that's in time or whether that's in distance, in countries. You were hearing things on the news that were happening in other places around the world, but it always felt like something that was happening to other people. And I think that's kind of how we often think of bad things in the world. We think that they happen to others as a sort of a way of thinking that maybe if we think that, we'll prevent them from happening to us. And I so, I was inspired also by Anne Frank to, as I started writing this diary. Initially, I was inspired by having a friend who was 3 years older than me, and she's somebody that I looked up to very much. Her name is Martina, and Martina had a diary. So I thought, oh, that seems like a thing you should do, because if Martina has it, I should have it as well. So I started keeping a diary, and I read the diary of Adrian Mole. I don't know if any of you guys know about it. It's written by an English writer. It's a fictional diary. But it's a story of a young man growing up in the 1980s England, and it was very funny, and I loved it. I read a lot of books and really enjoyed reading and writing. So I thought, brilliant, I'm going to have this diary because Martina has one and I should have one. I'm going to be really funny in it, and I'm going to, like Adrian Mole in Sue Townsend's book. And I'm going to, inspired by Anne Frank, I thought I'm going to give this this diary a name and make it a friend that I can talk to. And I chose the name Mimi, which was based on a goldfish I had for not a very long time, as they tend not to be around too often for too long. And so I decided to have this, this repository of memories. And I thought all I would really keep there is memories of going to school and going to music school and skiing and swimming and friends and parties in school and all that. And that's what I thought this would be a funny little notebook to have and revisit, in 20, 30, 40 years time, and remember these days. But then one day my life changed, and everything changed. And this was in April 1992. I was just a little bit over 11 years old. And it's the first day that I heard gunshots. Gunshots were now coming from these hills, these beautiful hills that I told you about, that we went hiking and skiing and sleighing in. These beautiful hills were suddenly filled with heavy artillery, with snipers. And the city that was, beautiful because it was surrounded by the mountains, that was its weakness. The weakness was that if you put heavy artillery and snipers around it, you can hold the city as though you're holding it in the palm of your hand. You can see everything that happens in it from the hills. And this is where these gunshots were coming from. And the first person died, and it was a young woman who was marching in the streets against this four-piece. And I just thought, well, what is this? This is not what happens to me. This is what happens in history. This is what happens to other people in different places around the world that I'm not really sure how to pronounce their names. But what is this? And this is not something that can happen to me. And then the first thought is, well, it's not something that will last a very long time, because that's another way of pushing it. This will be sorted in a week or so. And school stopped, which was a real sign that something was wrong. And that was the last day. I didn't go to school for nearly a year, just over a year. So my life as I knew it, the childhood that I had, changed. Everything changed. I was inside the house all the time because this heavy artillery was bombing the city. Bombs were falling, shells were falling all around the houses. Sniper was operating on this bridge in front of my house that you needed to cross to get into the city center, where you'd go shopping, and where my grandparents lived, and where my parents' work was. I was inside the house all the time. And then one day, when the bombing was really, really bad, we had to go and hide in the cellar underneath the house where we lived, because that was apparently what you did. That's how you hid from bombs, by going into cellars. And these cellars were, this basement was, where, I hated going, because I thought, monsters and witches lived. I never went there as a child, but suddenly this terrible, cold, smelly place was safety. And that's where we would go every time the bombs would start falling. Electricity was cut, water was cut. The post office around the corner from my house, which was the main post office for the city, was burned down. The telephone lines were cut. The shops were looted. There was no school. There was no work. There was no communication with anyone. And we really entered a zone which we felt that there was no indication of when and if this would ever end. And this was a very hard thing to take on. And my parents, I now realize, because I'm a parent myself, they couldn't provide any answers for me or any indication or any hope or anything, because they didn't know, and they didn't know why this was happening and why and how long this would go on for. All they could do is try and keep me safe as much as possible and try and feed me and try and have me continue to be, stimulated in terms of my mind, in terms of things that I would do. Um, and this is something that went on for a year and a half nearly for me. But it went on for 3.5 years for the city of Sarajevo, which is considered to be the longest siege in modern day history. 100,000 people were killed during this Bosnian conflict. 10,000 children were killed. And every day that was a very real reality and a real possibility for me, for my parents, that every day, every time my mom went out to go and try and find some bread or, go see her parents, or my father went out to do something, I didn't know if I would ever see them again. So it was a very, very difficult time because I couldn't share this with anyone. I didn't have any friends. I wasn't really being a child anymore. Everything that I had and everything that made my life a good childhood was gone. And this little notebook that I had, that I started, and I thought I would be recording only my happy memories of my childhood. As much as the war entered into my life, it entered into my diary. And I continued writing. I wasn't a kind of a regular daily writer, but I wrote when I felt like it. And I continued writing. And this time, rather than mark birthday parties or, what grades I got in school or what we were planning at the weekend, I was writing how many people were killed that day, when the electricity was cut, when was it maybe coming back on. But I was also writing about missing my friends, about missing school, about my feelings too. I was younger and 11. There's a kind of an internal life that will still develop more. But I still had thoughts, and sometimes quite dark thoughts, about what if this never ends? Because, as I said, there was no hope, there was no indication. And we felt completely forgotten by the world. I now realize that we had had so much more media attention than so many other conflicts, because we found ourselves in Europe, and we were therefore more covered by the media. So while we felt completely forgotten and that no one was doing anything to stop the suffering that was happening, comparatively, we were extremely well covered. And there were a lot of journalists who were in Sarajevo around that time. And what happened is, this diary that I continued writing, as I said, school stopped and there was no school for the first year of the war. But the first summer of the war, there was a sort of a summer school organized. It was just something local, kind of little initiative in this area of where we were living. And there was a sort of an idea to basically set up a school that young people could go to, that was very safe, that was in basements of kind of public buildings, and that they could kind of gather for occasional times and spend a little bit of time maybe doing something that was more childlike than sitting at home with their parents and running into the cellars, or something that would make them grow. So I joined something that was kind of offered there. One of the things that was offered was a literary group. So I thought, yeah, I like reading and writing, so I'll go and do that. And one day a teacher over there asked if anyone kept a diary. There was an idea that a diary of a young person living in Sarajevo. So in these schools that were local to mine, there were lots of these schools all around the city. An idea was, came that maybe we would, that there would be a diary that would be published, that would be selected from all these different schools, from all these different young people who were writing them, and that it would be published. So I thought, oh, well, that's something to do. One of the things that war also is it's also very, the kind of siege experience that we had. It was boring. There was nothing happening. There was nothing. There was no variety. Every day was exactly the same, and the only variety was happening was bad. Something bad was happening. So I thought, well, okay, well, maybe I'll give this and see what happens. And I completely forgot about it, and I continued writing in this diary. One thing I forgot to say, as well as marking, writing about these terrible kind of daily occurrences of sometimes, 900 and 50 bombs falling on the city in one day, and hearing of these massacres where people were waiting in bread queues, and because the guys on the hills could see everything, they could see when people were gathering, throw a bomb and have maximum effect in terms of hurting people. And this was kind of the daily life, but also the kind of the other side of all this, which was unexpected, I think, for most people, is there was an incredible community that formed itself, and this was a community of our neighbors. These people that we usually would have just sort of waved hello to and never really knew anything much about them, except that they lived there. Suddenly, because we were so kind of turned inward into the house, towards the basement, towards safety, not outward, because that's where the danger was more kind of strong. Um, we got to know our neighbors, and we got to really become extremely close with our neighbors. And there were a variety of people. There was, an older lady in her, 80s. There was a little girl who was 3. There was me who was 11. There were kind of all of our parents, people in their 40s and 50s, etc. And we started sharing everything, not only the moments, and but also sharing food, sharing, when somebody would maybe get something, they would open it up in front of everyone and share it with everyone, but also the support and the laughter, and trying to remember to continue being human, which was, to remember each other's birthdays, or give each other presents, or the reality of I guess my experience of war is that it had both these sides, and it showed the worst of being human, but it also gave an opportunity for the best of humanity to express itself, this, incredible capacity for kindness, for support, for love, despite and in spite of everything that was going on around us. So I wrote about both of those things and about my internal feelings. And when I handed this diary of mine to be kind of thrown onto a pile of lots of other diaries, and then I forgot about it, I continued noting these days. Um, sometimes thinking, well, there is a brighter day coming for us all. Sometimes thinking, I have no idea how long this will last, if I will ever go to school again, if I will ever see any of my friends again, but just living and trying to stay safe as much as possible. And a year later, sort of a note, there was no email, there was no telephones, there was nothing. Somehow some note came to us that they selected one diary to be published, and they selected mine. And at this stage, all it had was the first couple of months of the war, because that's when they were originally taken, and some excerpts from it that I gave them. I kept my original diary because I was afraid to give it away. I wasn't sure where, if I would ever see it again. So best that it stays with me. And I was contacted that this would happen. And again, like I said, because there wasn't anything else going on, this was kind of, exciting, something different, something else to do. And a lovely little book promotion was organized in a kind of basement again, because that's where we lived, a basement jazz club. And there was a woman who was an actress, and she was reading excerpts from it, and there was a pianist, and I spoke a little bit there, and the Bosnian television that continued working through and filming everything that was going on, they were present and did some video work of me. But what happened is that there was a Spanish journalist, and this is where I say we felt incredibly forgotten, but there was a lot of journalists who were in Bosnia at the time reporting on the conflict. We just felt forgotten because nothing was changing, and more people were dying every day. This journalist, Spanish journalist, was present, and he went back to the Holiday Inn Hotel, and the Holiday Inn Hotel is where all the journalists were staying, and told him, there's this young girl, she speaks English, because I was learning English from an early age, because I was with dweeby, and my parents enjoyed the idea of me learning. And she lives in the city center, and she had a diary. And so the next day, the journalists started coming to my there. I don't even know how they knew where I lived, but I guess it's easy to find out in a small enough city of 350,000 people. And they started coming to my door and asking me questions and interviews and, filming me play the piano that I was sometimes playing because it was in the dangerous room, which was where the windows were turned more towards the hills. Our entire life retreated into the kitchen, which was kind of in the heart of our apartment, not exposed to the outside. So they filmed me and they, filmed me writing and in my room, etc. And they left. And some I never saw again. Some of them were wonderful and came back the next time, even though they weren't writing, anything again. They came back to say hello or bring me a chocolate. And one kind of side note, I think, if you're a diary writer, you're a kind of person who likes to kind of remember things and likes kind of keeping an eye on little crumbs of your life so you don't forget things. And if you are that kind of a person, you're also likely a person who likes, keeping things, sort of mementos. And when these journalists started coming to my house, some would turn up and they were interviewing an 11-year-old, 12-year-old girl in 12-year-old girl in the city in under siege who's been living there for the last year, and they would come and bring a chocolate, and do the interview. And then there were people who came in and just did the interview, and then there were people who brought the chocolate, did the interview, and then the next time they were over, they didn't even do the interview, but they came and visited and brought a chocolate. And I kept all these wrappers, and I still have in our apartment in Sarajevo, which is still there. I still have all of these chocolate wrappers. There were Japanese ones and loads of American, different kind of candy and chocolates, and British ones and French ones and Italian ones, depending on where these journalists were from. I kept all these wrappers, and it's almost a kind of a memory of, which is becoming a documentary maker and working with people and filming people is something that I've always remembered. But anyway, these journalists were coming over and come and film or talk or record or whatever. And then some of them I'd never see again. And I didn't see where these stories went, but these stories went and were, in various, on ABC News or BBC or, French television, Italian television, Japanese television, etc. And there was a story, and suddenly this kind of label was attached to me. And the label was the Anne Frank of Sarajevo. And it's not something that in any way I felt comfortable with. Firstly, because I felt that, everybody is a sort of person for themselves for a start. Secondly, because Anne Frank was, older at a different time in a different kind of conflict, and obviously lived a faith and that was, in a different way, but still the kind of outcome, the final sort of part of it was something that was a real possibility for me. And I kind of felt superstitious, please don't compare me, because we all know what happened to Anne Frank. And that's something that can happen to me as well, because every day bombs are falling and snipers are operating in this city. So I felt very uncomfortable around it. But that was, just kind of how journalists worked. Um, anyway, because of these stories being written out and this story of this Anne Frank of Sarajevo existing, publishers started becoming interested, and they were kind of suddenly publishers contacting us again. Somehow messages were getting through without email and phone, asking if there was more of this diary. Is there, did I continue writing? Am I interested in getting it published? And one thing that happened at the start of the war is that I didn't leave. Like I said, I'm an only child, and there was an opportunity for me to leave on my own. And there was even a moment when my parents and I were crossing the bridge away from our house at the very start of the war, when there were still some planes and buses leaving. And we literally crossed the bridge halfway and went back, because we thought, this isn't going to last a very long time. It went on for 3.5 years. But also we don't want to separate as a family. And so we'll just, stay together for now and it'll be fine. But when these kind of offers, a year and a half nearly later, facing into the second winter of war, we just thought, okay, well, if these people are interested in a diary, maybe there's an opportunity here, even just for me to go to school and be safe somewhere. And we're okay about separating now, because the kind of life that we were living and the reality we were living was too much. So we started asking people, these publishers, is it possible that you maybe help Zlata leave and just go to school and be safe somewhere? And Sarajevo, as I said, was completely surrounded by hills. So it was, it was called the perfect circle. Nothing was getting in and out. The only thing that was getting in and out were these airplanes. And these airplanes were kind of bringing humanitarian aid and then leaving. And no publisher was ever going to break the perfect circle. But there was a French publisher who, the end, was somebody that managed to get us out and who published a diary. And we left, my mom and dad and I, on the 23rd of December 1993, year and a half and plus into the war. And we left everybody. We were allowed one suitcase each. And we were going to Paris, which I had never been in. At Christmas time, when a lot of families around the world are gathering around that time, and we were separating from everyone. We left my grandparents, all our lovely neighbors, all our friends, everybody that was part of our kind of mini world of the war. We left them all and went into France, and some of them we never saw again, because the reality of the conflict meant that they weren't that they were hurt. And so we went to France, and suddenly there was this kind of interest around me and my story, and more journalists and televisions, etc. And I felt really, really guilty. I felt really bad. I felt that, why did I get to leave when my best friend, who was only drawing, I was just keeping a diary? Why did I leave? Why did I get an opportunity to survive? And on top of it, with my parents, it was a very strange thing. No one got to experience this extreme lucky moment that we did. And only because I was inspired by my friend Martina, Adrian Mole diary, and, giving a name based on kind of Anne Frank's diary to this little notebook that became a kind of repository of what was happening to me, but what was happening to this kind of community of neighbors, and what was happening to this city under siege. And then I thought, well, they're still asking you, and they're still interested, and you are out. And they all stayed behind. My best friend, my uncle, my aunt, my cousins, my our neighbors, my grandparents, everyone stayed behind. So if I don't speak now, when they're asking me, well, then no one will know. And maybe if I speak, maybe something will happen. Maybe people will realize the reality for a daily life in a war that is truly coming from the person themselves. From my experience, it's not a journalist that's kind of processing it. It's coming from me, and I'm speaking for all of them who stayed behind. And that's what I did. And I kind of found myself in the strange position, age 13, where I was a spokesperson for my city that I left behind, and everyone that I loved that stayed behind in it. And what I learned, from that experience is that people really connected to, what surprised me is when I started speaking and going around schools and various different places and meeting presidents of countries, and kind of very, very strange for a 13-year-old who's just missed a year of school and suddenly was finding herself in this very strange position. But what I found, when I was meeting people and talking to people, is that as well as kind of trying, the way they were kind of connecting to it, they were kind of going, well, hang on, you like Michael Jackson and you were writing about Michael Jackson, and I like Michael Jackson music. So we are the same. Or you have a cat and I have a cat, yet you're going through a war and I'm not. So that makes me connect with you. And there were usually these really small little details, like, the fact that I played the piano, or that I liked this book, or, this cat was very, very popular, or Madonna, or, this was, let's not forget, the kind of early 90s. So there was a particular music scene going on around that time. And people really connected to these details. And on my side, I always thought, there's, why did I, as I was saying, I had this kind of almost, guilt about, why did I get to leave? Because I was writing this diary. And that day, when they asked, does anyone have a diary? There were probably so many more diaries that were presented by young people across the city. And somehow it was mine that was published. There were drawings. There were those who weren't writing. There were those who weren't there that day that were far better writers. So there was suddenly, I felt this kind of sea of people, young people, who were in some way expressing their experiences of the conflict. And it just happened that it was mine, but I could see how people were connecting to this based on those small little details. So fast forward about 10 years after I left Bosnia, and I went through school and university and all those things, and I was very happy. Um, I was I found myself contacted by a young woman who is a writer, and she was writing, she was interested in collaborating on on a work that would be something to do with young people's experiences of conflict. And we started talking, and we came up with this idea that this would be that we would work on a collection of diaries, of all these different diaries that exist, that are not there, that haven't been published, or were published and kept in sort of some library somewhere. But we wanted to bring these voices that were out there, voices of young people, and we were kind of strict about this idea. We wanted them to be, up to the age of 2021, through 20th century. And we started working on this, and it took us 3 years of research, of contacting various archives and libraries, etc. But we found and we created this collection. And I think this was a very important thing for me as well, personally. On the one hand, I felt that there was this experience I had where I saw how people connected to something that, as I said, we think conflict happens to other people. They connected to this kind of huge, vast thing of conflict based on small things that they could identify with. So if you somebody with a cat is experiencing a war, and you like cats, that's almost an easier way to see it and understand it than if you just kind of try and think, okay, how do I understand what an experience of conflict really is like? It's based on those details. So I felt that I really saw how people responded to those details. But on the other hand, like I said, I always felt like, why me? Why did I get published? So why, when there's so many others? So this was an opportunity to, collect a kind of a choir of voices. And the book ended up being called Stolen Voices, because it's these voices of youth, these young people, ranging from 11 to 20, from First World War up into Iraqi conflict of the early 2000s. This book was published in 2006. And it was an incredible experience to put them together. And it's interesting because obviously I know that the Holocaust Memorial Center is currently running an exhibition, which is based on another diary. This one we didn't come across. There's so many. There's forever going to be more and more to be uncovered and discovered. And, maybe people have great grandparents or grandparents in their families who kept them, that are kind of these records and these very, real flesh on history kind of records of certain historical events. So it was this very kind of book that I'm very proud of, that I did with Melanie Challenger, that ends up being used in schools. And, we really wanted it, when you're learning about a particular thing, to maybe connect with the person who was living that thing. And this idea, particularly when you're reading, you have to go really quiet into yourself and really listen to somebody. It's a real act of empathy. So we kind of wanted to create a book that would connect us and make us empathize with these young people throughout 20th century who were experiencing conflict. So it's now I do a different kind of work. I went, from telling my own story about a war and a diary to, putting together a collection that was kind of working with other personal stories, diaries of different conflicts. And what I do today is I work as a documentary filmmaker, producer largely, and I help others tell their stories in some way, whatever that topic might be. Where I work with others and establish this relationship that reminds me of those chocolate wrappers when I was 13 years old, and having a chance to help tell stories, whether they are about human rights issues or very personal stories, or that there's a kind of way by telling them truthfully and honestly, that we can really kind of inhabit them and make ourselves quiet and make ourselves more empathetic to these stories and these experiences. So that's where I am today. It would be a real pleasure to hear any questions, because I always enjoy answering questions, and it's sort of strange talking into a computer for a little while. So if there are any questions, I would be delighted to answer them. And thank you so much for allowing me some time to talk to you.
Thank you, Zlata. That was a incredible background for all of us who have not yet read your diary or the other Stolen Voices. I think this gives us an insight into what we're missing and encourages us to read. I'd like to take some questions from the audience. If you have questions for Zlata, please write them down. There's a Q&A button located at the bottom of your screens, and we'll get to as many of them as possible. One of the things that you mentioned that Stan, one of our docents, asked about was survivor guilt. And for those people who aren't as familiar with it, although it's obviously it's the kind of thing that happened also to survivors of the Holocaust, can you just speak for a minute, not only about your experience, but what you've learned about it?
Sorry, I didn't. There was the line got cut off. Do you mind repeating the question?
Could you speak a little bit about the idea behind survivor guilt? You mentioned it in terms of your own experience, but can you just what have you learned about it, and how do you think that your knowledge helps inform the work that you do?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think I was kind of quite strong there about that, but I got taken back there by kind of my feelings there when I was talking about it. About, because, there was not, why this diary, why me, why a diary, why not somebody who was, as I said, drawing, or my best friend was doing amazing drawings, but she didn't get out. So, and this question around the why was kind of weighing on me a lot. But then I kind of thought, okay, well, what do I do with it? And, I guess my kind of, I found myself in a position that I could do something about it. And what I could do is answer these questions and talk about this experience as, as almost a spokesperson for everyone else who wasn't there to speak for it. So, and it's strange because obviously I have over time met a lot of Holocaust survivors, and when I was younger and doing a lot more of these kind of talks and visits, I know for a lot of them that the idea of starting to talk about it came a lot later in their lives. So I was kind of unusual. I was straight from it, literally landed, and that night I was on the 8 o'clock news on French television speaking about it. And processing the kind of survival guilt, and feeling like I kind of needed to be an activist, even though I didn't have these words at the time, but and having my parents who were just kind of going, what's going on? Like, none of us expected this. We thought we were just leaving Bosnia and would be like the rest of our friends, starting a new, like, refugees in a new country, and instead there was a sort of a microphone handed to me. So it was about kind of trying to, I guess, transform that into something that could be useful for others, because I felt like I needed to do something for them, even if it was just for my grandmother and grandfather and my best friend who did the drawings, and my uncle,
One of the other viewers is asking, do you feel when you read diaries of those who survive, do they read differently than the diaries of those who did not survive? You were talking about yourself versus Anne Frank, but as you've collected these and you've read so many.
It's an interesting question. It was such an interesting experience to kind of go. Obviously, ultimately the collection has a limited number to, of course, the huge body of diaries or different kinds of writings that we kind of, Mel and I went through and read through. It was really interesting to sometimes find all these parallels, to go, right, hang on a second, this is written in 1942, but this person is having the exact same feeling that I am having, or this person is in 1967 and they're having this kind of thought or this experience. So it was very interesting that and they could talk to each other. It wasn't even just based on my own. Someone from 1914 could be talking to someone in 2003 in Iraq. There were all these parallels, and it was interesting. I don't think nobody knows when and if how their fate will go. I found that all of these diaries had both moments of despair and moments of beauty and hope and joy and desire for better days, and obviously all the more poignant when when it didn't happen for some of them. So I don't think there is a difference between those who survived or not, but I think there's definitely lots of similarities between them, even if the contexts are different, even if, you're in a different, and the strange thing is, unfortunately, this book finishes, it was published in 2006, it could keep, unfortunately, being added to. And, in the same way that I kind of found myself with this strange label of, Anne Frank of Sarajevo, I remember later on kind of the Anne Frank of Kabul, the Anne Frank of Baghdad, the Anne Frank, and you're kind of going, let's stop, please let's stop. Too many of these labels, but unfortunately, does continue.
You mentioned the exhibit we currently have, Rivka Lipschitz. She falls into this gray area because her diary stopped when she came to Auschwitz. It was discovered immediately after the war by a doctor who was in the Soviet army. She kept it and never published, never paid, it never became publicized until a few years ago when one of her grandchildren actually took it to be published. But in researching her, we actually don't know what happened to Rivka Lipschitz. It seems she survived for some time after the war, went to recovery, and then the trail runs cold. And so she may have survived and grown to be a mature person with a family. We have no idea. So
Wow.
sort of in this gray area in between where her words still speak to us, even though we didn't.
Their stories, yeah. I mean, we connect to them, by reading these 13 or 15-year-old or 17-year-old voices, and all this, beauty and potential for the kinds of people that they can be. And, I even find it, strange, why do you decide to write? Why do you, when there's a candlelight, there's a diary of another diary from the Holocaust of a young woman who basically was in hiding, in a basement underneath a house which was being visited by the Nazis, and with 17 other people in this basement hiding, and still deciding to write a diary, still finding paper, pen, light, and desire to express yourself. It's incredible, this kind of potential there.
So a couple of people have asked about the documentaries that you've helped produce over time. Are they available? Can people watch them?
Yeah, there's different ones. Some of them, because I live in Ireland, in Dublin, so some of them were on Irish television, so they would be maybe a little bit harder because of geo-blocking to be discovered. There were diaries, there were documentaries that there was one which was very exciting. It won an Emmy. It was about the fire. It was called The Farthest. It's about a Voyager space mission. So that was a kind of a really nice story of discovery and exploration. I've done documentaries about, obsessive compulsive disorder. I've done documentaries about LGBT rights here. I've done, minority rights as a minority group here in Ireland. There's lots of these different, I think like on IMDb, there's probably some sort of a list of all these different ones that I've done over time, and maybe some of them are available.
We'll post them to the chat so people can look. And I guess you're right, depending on the country you're in is what IMDb will show how they can be seen, but we'll post a link. A couple of people were asking about what happened in Sarajevo more recently. Do you still have friends who either stayed throughout the war or who returned there? What's their experience?
Yeah, so my, a kind of a very strong kind of parallel person is this friend of mine. So at the start of the war, an awful lot of my friends left, thinking that it would only last a short time and they'll be back in a couple of weeks. And, a lot of them just stayed, continued their lives, went on to another trajectory, and they ended up staying in Canada or Slovenia or Italy or wherever. And but my friend Mirna, who was with me throughout, we were there together, during the war. She didn't leave, I didn't leave. Then I had the chance to leave. Then I felt so worried about Mirna because I knew the reality of what she was living in. She ended up, for example, coming and she lived with us. There was an opportunity for her to leave as a 15-year-old girl, and she came and lived with us. We lived in France for a while, and then we moved to Ireland, and she lived with us. And then she went back and studied, etc. So she was a very strong continued link. And for me, I started, my grandmother stayed, my grandmother and grandfather stayed behind, but my grandfather passed away just very, very few days before the war officially ended, with one of these peace agreements that every war eventually kind of ends with, that one that stuck and worked. So it was my grandmother, and I continued a very strong relationship with Sarajevo, visiting her all the time. And she, yeah, so I continued a very strong relationship while I was still in school, and I had 3 months of holidays, and then, you know, life gets busier, and then you have 2 weeks, and there's COVID and various, and you have a child and they can't travel at that time, etc. So life is a bit different, but I haven't been now for a couple of years, but I'm really excited about going back, and it's a very important place to me.
You mentioned COVID. So Wendy, who's watching, asked whether you think that perhaps people ought to be getting together, if anyone's spoken to you about putting together some of the diaries of children and their experiences with COVID. Have you had any conversations about that?
Yeah, it's a very interesting idea. You know, it was kind of when kind of the restrictions were kicking in, you know, in Ireland, and suddenly there was, you know, it was very similar. There was so many parallels, and it surprised me. It really surprised me, because I kind of, maybe because I have spoken, you know, I've written about it in, you know, in a diary, which was my own little form of therapy. And then, you know, by speaking about it from a very early age, it was my way of processing it. So I don't feel that I live with very heavily with kind of my experience of the war in a kind of a very visceral way. But when the COVID started, when the restrictions started happening, and you knew that this entire world was changing and something really big was happening, and it was happening to all of us, and we didn't know how long it would last for, and we didn't know how it would end or when it would end, and we were literally, our lives were going to change. It reminded me so much of that first time. So, you know, every time the restrictions were eased, there was like, oh, is this it? Is this going to be okay? And that felt like all those peace agreements that were signed that never went anywhere. So even now, we're in this kind of, where are we? And it's exactly how it felt, you know, at the end of the war. Even though the official agreement was signed, it was like, is this the one? And so there's kind of there's been a lot of parallels. So yeah, I mean, I hope there were young people who found writing helpful to them for a start during this time, or expressing themselves in some way.
Okay, so I have one last question, which is your parents left with you at the end of the war? Excuse me, not at the end of the war, during the war when you were able to get out. What did they end up continuing in the same fields as they had when they were living in Sarajevo?
No, so my parents came with, you know, we left together, which was very, very unusual, and we moved to Paris, and then we moved to Dublin, and they live in Dublin still today. They, unfortunately, my father didn't, you know, he was a lawyer, and, you know, it came from this kind of long line. His father was a lawyer, his grandfather was a lawyer. You know, if we'd stayed in Bosnia, I probably would have been a lawyer, not a documentary maker slash writer slash activist of some sort. So he really loved it. He really loved it, and but unfortunately he couldn't. The law is different here, so he couldn't continue practicing, and it's a real shame. It's sad, because he loved his work, and but that's, you know, they ended up here, and they adjusted to new lives here.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Zlata. If you'd like to order a copy of her book, Zlata's Diary, or her book Stolen Voices that we've been talking about, there's a link in the chat so that you can order it from us. It's available for all fine booksellers as well. I want to thank again our program supporters, our community partners, and donors. Thank you all for listening in today and watching with us. We truly appreciate everything that all of you do to support the Holocaust Memorial Center. We're able to offer free events like this because of the generosity of caring supporters like you. If you'd like to consider making a donation, you can visit us at holocaustcenter.org/support. We talked a bit about our new special exhibit, The Girl in the Diary, Searching for Rivka from the Lodz Ghetto, which was based on a diary, as I mentioned, that was discovered in Auschwitz-Birkenau after the war. It was written by a Jewish teenager who had lived in the Lodz Ghetto. And the diary offers a glimpse, a moving glimpse, into the lives interrupted by the Holocaust. This exhibit was created by the Galicia Jewish Museum in Krakow, Poland, in cooperation with the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. So I invite you to come and see that exhibit here. We'll be together again on October 18th, on Monday, October 18th. Please join us for a discussion with musician and filmmaker Ashton Gleckman, with Detroit News film critic Adam Graham. They're going to discuss Ashton's award-winning documentary, We Shall Not Die Now, That is going to be available to view on our website prior from October 13 to 18. So you've seen it. If you had a chance to see it before the discussion with Ashton, to register for the Zoom event, please visit Holocaust Center.